Second service, how we doing? Fantastic. I know it's a big game today. Niners people, are we in the house? Yeah? Eagles? Okay. Good. I'm predicting that nobody's going to be at the third service except the people that just do not clued into football or sports at all, because the game starts at noon, I think, today. So, hey, so we've been in this conversation all about mail and really the power of mail. And each week, kind of before we get into it, I try to give you some kind of interesting little mail nugget or fact or story. And today, what I'd like to do is talk to you about a very specific kind of mail, the breakup letter. The breakup letter. Any of you ever write a breakup letter in your day, like a little post-it note, or back in the day, it used to be letters. Today it's like texting, like a text breakup, or now people don't even text, they just start ignoring you, ghosting, right? Like that's just, hey, so are we still together? No, I stopped communicating with you. That means we're done. But before all of that, there was this idea of like writing a letter about your breakup, or to the person you're breaking up with, or who's breaking up with you, or however it might go. And I came across this a couple that I thought were really kind of fascinating. The first kind of in your head, go back, Hollywood, 60s, 70s, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. You know these people, big time Hollywood couple back in the day. Very manic relationship. They married and divorced twice, right? And Burton, though, writes to Elizabeth Taylor this really kind of epic love letter. And in it, here's just my favorite little bit that Burton writes. He says this, I can barely believe it since I'm so accustomed to anybody leaving me. Okay, buddy. I'm the one that does the breaking up. But reflectively, I wonder why nobody did so before. I'm a smashing bore, and why you stuck with me so long is an indication of your loyalty. Here, I just love this line. I shall miss you with passion and wild regret. Also, you may not know this, but John Lennon wrote a letter to Paul McCartney as a part of the Beatles breakup, and it got a little dicey. But it's a very popular letter that sold for $56,000 last year at an auction. So there's the letter. You can actually go find it and read it, and he gets a little bit. Lennon gets a little cranky with McCartney a little bit. But this idea of breakup letters actually super, we know that it predates Jesus, because in fact, we actually have a breakup letter from 2,600 years ago written on a stone tab. I mean, that's how committed of a breakup this was. I'm writing it in stone. And it was written by the last king of an empire known as the Babylonian Empire. And the king's name was King Nabonidus or something like that. I even looked up how to pronounce it earlier and I just forgot because this letter's so great. Just take a look at his letter breaking up. News has reached me via the upper Euphrates that you were visiting my childhood friend Nisba. I'm devastated by this betrayal, as you're one of my favorite concubines. Yes. Now that's how you break up. You have until the end of the month to pick up your flax shawls and sandals, or else I'll donate them to the temple of the moon god. Come get your stuff, or it's going to church. I just love history so much, right? I mean, it's incredible. But perhaps the most famous breakup letter in the history of the world actually has a lot to do with the founding of our nation. The most famous breakup letter of all time, I think you could make an argument for, is the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, which is essentially the American colonies breaking up with King George. And here, if you've never read the Declaration, please go home and do that. But here's a bit of how it begins. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When the course of human events, it becomes necessary for which people to, here's the big breakup line, dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. And there's a couple lines, then they add this. And a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires They should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. In other words, King George, we are done with you. And if you ever watched that the musical Hamilton, there's this great song that King George sings called "You'll Be Back." It's fantastic, and it's all about sort of their America's Declaration of Independence. Anyway, it's a really kind of funny, comical interlude. But that's probably the most famous breakup letter of all time. Is when America broke up with King George, and you and I, that breakup shook world history, and you and I are here today living in the United States of America and not the United Kingdom. Now, I talk about breakup letters. This actually matters, why I wanted to get you thinking towards breakup letter. Because, again, we're doing this Mailbag teaching series, right? Mailbag, ancient letters, modern lessons. We've been focusing on this little collection of 13 letters that have all been attributed to one man. And today, the world knows this guy as the Apostle Paul. And what we've said is, listen, it's important to have a conversation about these letters. And again, outside of church, inside of church, you're a church person, Bible person, or you're not a church person, Bible person. We need to know about these 13 letters, and we need to know about this guy, the Apostle Paul, because his words go beyond religious circles. His words go beyond this Christian tradition, because what everybody agrees on, right? People within the Christian world, people outside of the Christian world, everybody agrees that if you believe what Paul thought about God or not is not really the point. The point is his words, that collection of 13 letters, it has impacted the world. In fact, the argument's made that these 13 letters actually help to shape Western civilization. That is to say that these 13 letters, if you're a church person or not, has shaped the world that you and I live in today. And what we've been doing in this teaching series, we've just been pulling one letter out at a time and kind of taking a little bit of a dive into it and seeing what we can learn. And today's letter is interesting because the first couple we looked at were to a very specific city. This letter is sort of broad. It's to an entire region known as the region of Galatia. And today that would be like the central part of modern day Turkey, right? So there's in the Roman Empire, they kind of broke up Turkey into like a western, a central, and sort of an eastern region. And Galatia is the center region. And in it, if you ever kind of open up your Christian scripture, we call it the New Testament, you'll run into some cities that get mentioned: Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. These are all cities that kind of lived in the center part of Galatia. And Paul's letter to this region is essentially a breakup letter. That's what this letter is. And who's Paul breaking up with? Well, it's not a person per se. He's breaking up with religion. Paul's breaking up with religion, and he's reminding the people he's writing to, Jesus didn't come to start another religion. Let it go. He came to offer himself. So Paul's breaking up with religion. That's the letter to Galatia. We call it today just Galatians or the book of Galatians. Right? It's a breakup letter with religion. But we'll get there. We'll get to all of that and what I mean by that in a moment. Just a reminder, if you're just tuning in, each teaching in this series, we're really just trying to answer 3 questions. Who's Paul writing to? Why is Paul writing them? And then we don't have time to get into every little thing in the letter, so I just want you to know one thing. I want you to walk out of here every week just knowing one thing about this letter. And so, let's just go. Who's Paul writing to, right? Who's he writing to? Again, he's writing to this region, but there are a couple of things I think are helpful and kind of interesting to know about this region. The first is the capital, and probably where most of the people were reading this letter of this region of Galatia, is called the city of Antioch. Antioch, capital of Galatia, 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire, a very big deal city. Antioch was the headquarters of like the most eastern Roman garrison, right? Their army. They were to protect Rome from this constant ongoing invasion of this other kind of enemy empire called the Persians, right? And they kept wanting to kind of move in on Roman territory. So Antioch housed the big army that was to protect the rest of the Roman Empire from the Persians. Antioch was also a very early sort of hub or center for Christianity. In fact, it's probably, we could say that Antioch was, if the Apostle Paul had a headquarters, it was probably Antioch. And then here's what's really interesting about Antioch. It's the place where Jesus people first started to be called Christians. It happened in the city of Antioch. And it actually, this gets recorded not in Galatians. We've been mentioning this other book in the New Testament, the Christian scripture, called the Book of Acts. And the Book of Acts is sort of like the Apostle Paul's propaganda letter. It's all about the adventures of the Apostle Paul, and it sort of tells his story. And in it, it's written by a historian named Luke. And Acts tells this story of, like, in the beginning, all the Christians, all the people who were following Jesus, they lived. Remember, they called themselves the Way. They weren't Christians yet. It wasn't Christianity. It was just the Way. It was actually part of Judaism, really. But pretty soon, a whole little persecution broke out. All the other Jews were like, no, your version of Judaism's terrible. Get out of here. And so there's this whole persecution. So all the followers of the Way, all the Jesus people, once that happens, they leave and they scatter. And some make their way 300 miles to the north to the city of Antioch. Again, these are all Jewish people who have now turned to Jesus, and now they find themselves not in a Jewish city, but in a Greco-Roman city, right? So there's Jews and there's a bunch of Greek, Roman, and again, if you weren't Jewish, we were just called a Gentile, right? And these Jews get to Antioch and they say to all these Gentiles, oh my gosh, you guys, God's done something incredible in Jerusalem. There was this man, his name was Jesus. He actually was executed by the Romans, but he came back to life. And we saw it, not only us, but like a bunch of other people saw it. We saw this happen. So what happens is, a bunch of Greek-speaking, Roman-minded people in the city of Antioch, they begin to embrace Christianity. They're like, yes, let's get on that. And again, it's not Christianity yet. It's this knock-off religion, sect, branch of the Jewish faith, of Judaism. And all of a sudden, this little church gets started in the city of Antioch. But this new little church, it needs leadership, right? They got no one kind of organizing the thing. I mean, it's kind of chaos. So a bunch of people decide, let's send this guy named Barnabas. Could you go up to Antioch and get him kind of dialed in and organized? Barnabas says yes. So he goes up to Antioch, and he gets there, and the church is bigger and kind of more of a mess than he thought, and he says, I need some help. And he knew about 85 miles away, the Apostle Paul, this guy Paul, was visiting home in a place called Tarsus. And so he goes over to Tarsus and says, Paul, got this whole thing. I mean, man, church is growing in Antioch. I need some help. Would you come and help me out? And Paul says, sure, I'll come help. And it actually, Luke, this historian Luke, records what happens. Here's what we read. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus. Now, here's kind of an interesting to look for Saul. Well, who's Saul? Well, Saul's actually the Apostle Paul. Saul's name in Hebrew, Jewish, right, was Saul. You pronounced his name, though, in like Greek as Paul. So he's Saul and he's Paul, but pretty much right after this, he just goes by Paul. So Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, the Apostle Paul, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. For a whole year, Barnabas and Saul, Paul, met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples, the learners, the students, the people following Jesus. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. Now, important to note, they didn't call themselves Christians. They were being called Christians by people on the outside looking in. And it was kind of a making fun of kind of thing. It wasn't necessarily like a good thing to be called, but they were being called Christian first at Antioch. It was the label that was put on them by outsiders. Now, here's what's kind of fascinating. The evidence of the disciples being called Christians by people that weren't Christians, actually we have evidence outside of the Bible that kind of points to this, and it's from a Roman historian named Tacitus. Tacitus loved telling the stories of some of the big Roman emperors. And one of the emperors he loved to write about was this guy named Nero. Now, Nero was an absolute psychopath. And he gets blamed for, and history's debatable, but we'll just say he did. He gets blamed for, in the year 64, for deciding that he wanted to start Rome over, so he burned it to the ground. Well, this obviously does not go well, right? There's 1 million people living in Rome. Everybody's displaced, and everybody's grumpy at Nero. The PR is bad. So he decides to cast blame on the Jesus people. And Tacitus writes about this. And here's what Tacitus wrote. Consequently, to get rid of the report that it was Nero who burned the city down, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians. By who? The Christians? No, by the populace, by the crowd, by the people who weren't Christian, the people outside of the movement looking in. Christians never called themselves Christians until much, much later. They called themselves something else. But the populace, the people, the outsiders, they coined this term. Could you imagine being the dude who coined the phrase Christian and it lasted 2,000 years, right? I mean, that's like sticking language. I just wish I was that cool that I came up with a word that 2,000 years from now, people will still be using. But some guy did, and he called them Christians. Tacitus actually goes on and tells us why they're called Christians. Christ, from whom the name had its origin. Now, this is so important. You don't care, but I'm about to tell you why this is so important. Had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius, who was an emperor of Rome, at the hands of one of our procreators, governors, Pontius Pilate. Now, yes, we have evidence that Christians were called Christians by people that weren't Christians. But more importantly, this right here is the only evidence that exists outside of the Bible that agrees with the Bible that Jesus of Nazareth was executed by a Roman governor named Pontius Pilate. This is it, right here. It's so important that we know about Cornelius Tacitus because he verifies what the biography of Jesus tells us. So, all of that's happening. That's who Paul's writing to. He's writing to primarily probably the city of Antioch where Christians were first called Christians, right? But why is he writing this letter? Why? Well, I've already told you it's to break up with religion, but here's what I mean by that. Here's what we know. We know from the letter, if you go read it, that Paul's received a letter from the Galatian Christians. They wrote to him and they said, look, there's a lot of confusion and conflict right now. Once you and Barnabas left, some people from Jerusalem, they came up and they started teaching us some stuff that doesn't seem to vibe with what you taught us. And now we don't know what to believe, right? And Galatians, this letter is essentially Paul's response to what's going on in Galatia, his response to their letter to him, and he is not happy. Like Paul is in a mood, he's hot, he is very upset when he's writing this letter. In fact, as the letter goes on, Paul gets madder and madder. He's so grumpy about it. In fact, let me just show you. So here's the very beginning of the letter. Paul writes, I'm astonished that you Galatian Christians, and probably most of you are in Antioch, or deserting. You're leaving what I taught you, the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ, and are turning to a totally different kind of teaching. Why are you doing that? And by the time he gets to the middle of the letter, so that's kind of soft, but by the middle, he's like, you idiots, right? You foolish Galatians, who's bewitched you, right? Somebody's bewitched you. And then by the end, he is very hot. As for those agitators, those people from Jerusalem coming up saying things that are in conflict to what I said, I wish they'd go the whole way and emasculate themselves. Whoa, man. What? I mean, Paul is fired up. And so what is Paul so mad about? Well, again, some context. Remember, Antioch, Greco-Roman city, Greek-speaking, Roman-minded people, lots of non-Jews, lots of Gentiles, right? And they start to embrace Jesus and this grace and forgiveness and love. And they're like, yeah, we love this Jesus guy. But again, what happens? Paul and Barnabas leave. Then some other kind of more Jewish-minded Christians, they come up to Jerusalem. And they're part of this tradition that's like steeped with thousands of years of law and tradition. And they have authentically turned to Jesus, but they still understood Christianity as like this extension of Judaism. And they made the assumption that in order to become a follower of Jesus, you first had to become a follower of Moses, which is to say you had to become Jewish, right? So they came up and said, no, Paul got it wrong. You got it. You Greek-speaking, Roman-minded people, I know you're not Jewish, but if you want to be Christian, you got to be Jewish first. In fact, this becomes a whole thing, right? And here's actually that historian I keep talking about, Luke. Here's what he writes. He writes, certain people came down from Judea, Jerusalem, Israel, Jewish people, to Antioch, and were teaching the believers, these Gentiles, unless you're circumcised according to the customs taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. In other words, these Jewish Christians are telling these Greco-Roman Christians, unless you have surgery first, you cannot follow Jesus. You can't be Christian until you become Jewish. Well, again, Paul gets word that that's what's happening, and he is fired up. He's so incredibly upset, so he sits down and he writes Galatians as his response letter. Because Paul's message was very, very simple. 3 words. Jesus is enough. That's it. That was Paul's message. Adding anything to Jesus actually subtracts from Jesus. When you add to Jesus, you're getting less Jesus. When you add to Jesus, you're saying that Jesus is not enough. In fact, this was kind of a fight that we fought as a church. If you've been around for about 15 years. When I first worked here, I was not the lead pastor. A buddy of mine was. His name was Steve Harms. And Steve decides one day, about 15 years ago, that he's going to get up here. And he coins this phrase, that Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Jesus plus nothing equals, you would have thought, people revolted. They were so angry. Facebook pages were started to just call us all kinds of names. And it was like this whole thing. Hundreds of people left Neighborhood Church because Steve stood up here and said, Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Right? It was a huge kind of thing because some people, just like in Paul's day, were absolutely convinced you've got to have more than just Jesus. And Paul's letter to the Galatians is just his argument against adding anything to Jesus by creating religious hoops people need to jump through in order to follow Jesus. Right? And again, in Paul's day, it was about Judaism and following Moses before you follow Jesus. It was about circumcision. It was about all of that. Today, it can be any number of things that we want to put in the way and say, that's great, love that you're here, but if you could, A, B, C, D, then you can be part of our group. And Paul's saying, absolutely not. He gets so mad. He says, and the people with that message, go ahead and emasculate yourself, right? That's the message, right? In fact, this argument, this gets so big in the early church that actually they have this big council and everybody's invited and Paul's with Barnabas and they're like, no, the whole follow Moses before you follow Jesus, that's garbage. There's a bunch of other people, no, you got to follow Moses, And they have this fight, but at the end of the fight, the leader of the day, his name was James, actually Jesus' half-brother, he stands up and he says these very famous words. And he basically sides with Paul and he says, listen, it's my judgment, therefore, that you should not make it difficult for Gentiles, for anyone who's turning to God. Do not make it hard for people that want to find Jesus. Do not put walls up. Do not put boundaries up. Do not put hoops in front of them. Let them clear the path for them to find Jesus. You do not have to jump through hoops to get Jesus, because Jesus is enough. And with that said, here's the one thing I think you need to know before you leave about Paul's letter to Galatians, and really it's a summary of this Jesus is enough argument. Here it is. And Paul's weird. He writes, he's just so smart. He's smarter than everyone. And plus it's like 2,000 years ago, so it's kind of weird. I'll try to walk us through it a little bit. Here's what Paul writes. Here's what you need to know. It is for freedom that Christ, now remember, Christ is not Jesus' last name. It just means king. So it's for King Jesus, that freedom, that he set you free. So stand firm then and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. That's what he calls religion. Do not be burdened by religion. Let it go. That's slavery. Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, or if you let yourself build a wall between you and someone else that wants to find Jesus, Jesus is of no value to you at all. If you want to do the religion thing, that's fine. But just know Jesus doesn't matter then. You can go ahead and just follow the rules. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he's obligated to obey the whole law. This is Paul saying, fine, you want to do the whole circumcision surgery thing? Go for it. Just know you don't get to pick and choose. There's 600 other laws let's go back, right? Some of them were weird, right? You can't you got to follow kosher laws, right? You can't eat shellfish. There's all sorts of things you can't do, right? You can't even wear polycotton blends of clothing, right? If you're following all that. Paul's saying, listen, go for it. But just know there's not one law. There's 600 and some change laws. Paul goes on. You who are trying to be justified, made right, make your way to Jesus. By the law, you've actually alienated yourself from Jesus. You're farther away now than you ever were. You have fallen away from grace. Again, Paul's saying, listen, if you say, yeah, grace, we love Jesus, but the second you say but, you are not talking about grace anymore. You're talking about something completely different. And Paul's just saying, don't do that. Why do that? For through the Spirit, we eagerly await by faith the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus, in King Jesus, neither circumcision or uncircumcision has any, in other words, why are we even talking about this? It does not matter. It does not matter. And here it is. If you're going to hear anything else I say, actually, it's me just quoting Paul. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. The only thing that counts. That's it. This is it. What counts? How do I show my devotion to this Jesus? Do I have to go get circumcised? Nope. No. The way you show devotion to Jesus is by love for others. That's it. That's it. The only thing that counts. In fact, it's so important. Let's say it together, like you mean it. First service, I don't think they meant it. So, and this is now a new religious hoop where you have to say it like you mean it or you're not going to heaven. Okay, so ready? 1, 2, 3. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. That's it. That's it. Yes. Whoever added that's it. Yes. Right? There's a pastor out in Tennessee, and Tennessee's its own situation, but there is a pastor out there. His name's Doug Bannister, and he wrote this, and I just love it. Religion, a tiresome system of man-made do's and don'ts, woulds and shoulds, impotent to change human lives, but tragically capable of devastating them. I listen to lots of stories from you all, and many of you have a story that goes something like, I haven't been to church in years because, and then you tell me your church hurt story, your really bad church experience story, your story of how religion hurt you and devastated your life. Religion, Bannister argues, is what is left after a true love for God's drained away. What's true love for God? Loving other people. Religion is the shell that's left after the real thing has disappeared. Jesus did not come to start a new religion we call Christianity. He came to offer an alternative to religion himself. That's it. Jesus did not invite people to trade one lifeless religion for the new one that he wanted to start. Jesus invited and still invites people beyond the borders of religion, beyond the borders of regulation, beyond the borders of rituals and routines, and into a relationship with himself that leads to loving other people. Pastor in Canada, former pastor in Canada, his name was Bruxy Cavey, he said it like this. He said, the Jesus of the Bible lives by a simple philosophy. If love guides our hearts, rules become redundant. With love, you do not need religion because you don't need the rules. You don't need a rule that says don't steal, don't kill, don't whatever, because love already tells you not to do that. Love embraced as a guiding orientation of others. Again, love, it's not like love, oh, I love you and you're so sweet. It's love, I'm going to sacrifice on behalf of your well-being. Love will always lead us to do the right thing. Jesus' goal, goodness gracious, and it's so annoying to me. I'm with Paul. It's so annoying when we convince people that Christianity is about not being naughty. Are you kidding me? That Christianity is just about trying to avoid doing bad things that we mostly just make up and decide on our own what's bad or good. No, Christianity is a life filled with love. Let me close. And I've shared this picture with you before. It's really two pictures, but it's just one of those things I'm just going to keep coming back to because it's so, so important. It just drives almost everything we say up here. And it's really two pictures, and they're not my pictures. One of my seminary professors, his name was Dr. Mark Baker. He came up with these two pictures. He wrote a book about these two pictures. It's called Centered Set Church, and here's the pictures. Bounded set, centered set. What's Paul talking about in Galatians? How is he breaking up with religion? All of it. Here it is. He says, listen, the people from Jerusalem who are coming up and telling you a bunch of crazy things like you have to follow Moses to follow Jesus, just know they're creating what we can call a bounded set version of Christianity. They're creating boundaries to divide people so that everybody's clear on who's in and who's out. And we know who is naughty and we know for crying out loud, if Santa had a list, Jesus must have a list. Right? That's bounded set, right? That's like, this is who's in, this is who's out, and we know how to divide you up. That we build walls, we give tests, litmus tests, right? That determine one's entrance into community. And if we do that, Paul's argument, if you go, it takes 13 minutes to read this letter. What you'll find is Paul saying, that's not Jesus. That's like a whole other thing that just hurts people. It actually doesn't help you get to Jesus, right? If you want to create boundaries, right? And by the way, have you ever noticed that the people that make the boundaries, how come they're always the one on the inside? That's how you know bounded set doesn't work, right? The people on the inside, somehow they're always miraculously in, right? He says, if you do this, you will have said goodbye to Jesus and hello to religion. It creates a version of Christianity that, again, is just about avoiding bad things. It is not a Christianity that's filled with genuine love. And you know what's funny? Every time I say something like this, you know what? Somebody, without question, is going to come up to me. And they say, Forrest, come on, man. But we got to stand for something. If we don't stand for something, we'll fall for anything. Please do not email me that or say that to me because I will make you feel bad about yourself. And my response is always pretty simple. So love isn't a thing to stand on? Love's not a thing we can orient our lives around? It's not like love is ethic-free. There's an ethic to other-centered, sacrificial love. Of course there is. But you can enter into it without the hoops. So around here, it's why when people say you got to stand for something, well, what they're saying is you got to have boundaries because we got to know who's not like us. And I say, that's dumb. Paul thought it was dumb. Jesus thought it was dumb. Because you can actually have all of that Jesus stands for without making people feel bad about themselves. And so Paul says in Galatians, don't let people do that to you because all of a sudden Jesus is going to have no value for you. So he gives an alternative. My seminary professor calls it centered set Christianity. That Christianity is not a movement with firm boundaries. It's a movement with a firm center whose name is Jesus. In a centered version of Christianity, the focus is on Jesus, not a system, not a boundary, not a measurement to determine group inclusion. You're not in or out. You're simply positioned around a fixed center, Jesus. And now we have a totally new set of questions. No longer is it, do you qualify? It's, where are you headed? And can we help? Life's hard. Can we help? Right? You're not in or out. You're simply positioned around a fixed center, right? That's it. In the centered version of Christianity, Jesus is already everything the boundaries are trying to accomplish. Christianity isn't about this particular way of being religious. It's not about a particular way of how you get saved and avoid hell. Christianity isn't dogma or doctrine. It's not a boundary. It's a person named Jesus who invites you in to an ethic called love. Sacrificial, other-centered love that he models for us on the cross, right? He says, let me show you how this works as he dies on behalf. He gives the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of other people. Remember, here it is. Paul's breaking up with religion in Galatians. And his mic drop line that you need to know. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself in love. That's it. Paul broke up with religion 2,000 years ago, and yet for some reason, we are absolutely committed to making sure we keep bringing it back. We are not Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor who can just keep getting married and breaking up. Paul broke up with religion, and we're meant to stay broken up with religion and love people. Right? Sound okay?